Welcome back. With strategies under our belt, it's time now to take a look at the process of reframing. So let's turn to page 67. Reframing is essentially about changing the meaning or the context of a presenting problem that we're dealing with. In selling, reframing is called answering objections, and of course there are books and books and books on the subject in the field of sales. What we want to talk about now is reframing from an NLP perspective. How do you change the meaning or content, or how do you reframe, or how do you answer simple objections that people might have, either in sales, to purchasing your product, in management, to actually doing what you're asking them to do, in education, to actually have children learn better, and in therapy, to actually change the context or the ability of the person to make the changes that they've asked you or told you that they want to make. Now, if we go back and look at page 12, what we'll notice is in the presuppositions of NLP, you remember the presupposition, the map is not the territory. And what we said when we talked about the map is not the territory, we said that all meaning is dependent upon the context in which it appears. That is to say that if a certain word has a certain meaning, well, the meaning of that word depends on the context in which it appears. Now, I wasn't aware of this, and I don't know if you were or not, but you know how they make a dictionary? In order to make a dictionary, if you wanted to make a brand new dictionary, what you and I might do is we'd go out and we'd buy all of the books in print. And with all the books in print under our belt, what we would do is we'd take and make a 3x5 card for every word that we found in each of those books. And then, having taken and made a 3x5 card for each single word, we would then determine the meaning of the word by looking at the context in which it appears. So the truth is that all of our language, even today, even the dictionary definition of the words we use, is based on the context in which it appears. Now, if that's the case, if all meaning is context dependent, then what that means is that all meaning is context dependent. And that means that all meaning is dependent upon the context or the process or the structure in which it appears. Let's look at this from another direction. It also means that all content is reframable by simply changing the context. If we change the context in which it appears, if we change the process that's going on around it, or if we change the actual structure of what we're talking about, that we can actually reframe virtually anything. Now, if we take a look at our NLP communication model on page 7, you'll notice that the internal representation, which is made up of visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, gustatory, and auditory digital, that auditory digital, if we actually change a part of the internal representation, then we can actually change a part of the meaning of the behavior or the meaning of what the client is asking us. And so we can make a significant change in the presenting problem even before we do an intervention. And we're going to talk about intervention shortly. How would you do a specific intervention using NLP? And we're going to sort of put this all together. Interimly, however, before we get there, we need to look a little bit at the process of how do you actually loosen up the client's model of the world, or how do you change things so that it makes it easier for the client to make the kind of changes that he wants to or she wants to. Now, if all meaning is context dependent, that means that everything that we know or say or think is based on the context in which it's uttered or thought, and that the only meaning is that context. Now, if we look at page 67, let's look at page 67, our reframing page. If we look at page 67, and you may notice, for example, that the words good or bad have their basis in the meaning at either ends of the dichotomy. That would be good, or the dichotomy of good to bad. If you notice that the words themselves, good or bad, have a meaning based on being at the opposite end of a single pole, from good to bad. If you think about reframing, what we're going to be doing is literally going in and changing the basis of the problem that the client gives us. We're actually going to make a shift in the nature of the problem. Now, how do we do that? Well, any specific problem is simply content. Every problem that a client gives us is, to a certain extent, is based in content. But at the same time, as we listen to the presenting problem that the client gives us, and we go through and specify the outcomes with the problem as we've discussed in a previous program. If we go through and listen carefully what the client's saying, if we listen carefully to what the client's saying and we listen to the content of the problem, we're also going to be picking up a sort of a sense of what the structure of the problem is and a sense of the context in which it occurs. If we shift the context of the problem, we can change the nature of the problem. And now that's exciting. That's exciting. If you're in sales, of course, this may be the mother lode. Because when you think about it, I don't know if for you, if you're in selling, but when I first got into radio advertising and began selling radio advertising, the boss called me in his office and he said, "Well, Tad, here are the 10 objections to radio." And I went, "Whoa." And he said, "Memorize them and give those answers." And so what we had the 10 basic objections, and we memorized the answers. And anytime someone gave us an objection, we would parrot off one of the answers that they gave us. But imagine reframing. Now think of this for just a minute. Imagine reframing, learning reframing itself gives you the basis behind the basis that the people who made up the answers to all the objections, it's what they used to create all the answers to the objections. Whoa. So reframing actually puts us in charge, or puts you personally in charge, of the basis behind the basis of answering all the objections. Now, this short program is by no means all there is to say about reframing. In fact, in our master practitioner training, we go into reframing really, really in depth. So this is really an introduction for you. As a practitioner of NLP, this is an introduction as to how do you actually do a couple of basic kinds of reframes. And what is going to be the effect of changing or making a change for a client? What can we predict that the effect might be? Now, based on the structure of everything we've covered so far, you might ask yourself, or I might ask you, if we were in class, I might say, what different kind of reframes do you think there might be? Well, of course, the answer is on page 67. Typically, we're going to look at a couple of different kinds of reframes here. We're going to look at a context reframe, and we're going to look at a meaning reframe. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these and noticing what they actually make a change in. What do they change, and how can we learn how to do this sort of in our head on the fly? The notion of reframing comes from hypnosis and Milton Erickson, and it also comes from transformational grammar and people like Paul Václavic. I think a good book to read on reframing is Reframing by Bandler and Grinder, and Life Reframing in Hypnosis by Milton Erickson. The Rossi books are good. The Erickson and Rossi books are also good on reading, good for reading. And I think also How Real is Real by Paul Václavic. Those are some pretty good books on reframing and beginning to think differently about content. Let me give you a thought. One of the things that Einstein used to do in creating his theory of relativity is he used to sit and contemplate paradox. The thing that's nice about paradox is, and I don't mean a couple of chiropractors playing golf on a golf course. The thing about paradox is that it gives us the ability to shift logical levels and step outside of what the problem is. Now, by shift logical levels, I mean, remember the hierarchy of ideas. By shift logical levels in this context, I mean that you can actually chunk up one level or go to a higher level of abstraction. Now, one of my favorite paradoxes is from the book How Real is Real. And what Václavic says in this book is, and this is real interesting, Václavic says that he talks about this really nice paradox. So just for fun, if you want to play and do this paradox with me, why don't you take and draw on a piece of paper, it could even be on page 67, a box. And what I'd like you to do is I would like you to put your initials in the box if and only if that you can predict that when I look at the box next, the box will be empty. Interesting, huh? So I'll say it again. Would you please initial the box if inside the box, if and only if that when I look at the box, you can predict that the box will be empty. That's a fun sort of a paradox. The thing about paradoxes is that they're only resolvable on a higher logical level, which is what really makes them so much fun to contemplate. And reframing to a large extent is about shifting the context or shifting your thinking from the level that you're at to a higher logical level. It's about changing and moving to a higher logical level. If you change the thinking and you move to a higher logical level, what's going to happen is that you'll be thinking outside of the box that the client's thinking in. Now, here's the thing. The client comes to you with a problem. Their problem is on a certain logical level, or their problem is in a certain context, or their problem has a certain set of parameters around it. In essence, we could say their problem's got a box around it. Now, the only way that you're going to be able to think outside the box for the client is if you've practiced it. Now, this is true whether it's in therapy or in education or in business. Your ability to think outside the box is what's going to give your client and you the most flexibility to make changes. So contemplating reframing and contemplating paradox is probably one of the most important things you can do in NLP to begin to stretch your brain, to actually begin and see what kinds of things that you can think of differently from the way the client presents a presenting problem to you. Now, that's kind of fun to think about. So we're looking at page 67. A context reframe is best deliverable in the case of a comparative deletion. And in this case, you're going to think of a different context in which the person will respond differently to the same behavior. Now, we could also look at, in the wall chart section, page 12, we could look at wall chart number 71. And on there, it actually says that a context reframe is best in the case of a comparative deletion. On page 67, it says that the context reframe, the comparative deletion is, here's an example of it. I'm too X or he's too X. So I'm too tall, I'm too short, I'm too happy. Those kinds of things, which is the comparative deletion, is the best case for a context reframe. Now, what you want to do in a case of a context reframe is you want to ask yourself, what's another context for this behavior? What's another context for this behavior where the meaning of the behavior will be different, or where the person will respond differently to the same behavior? One of my favorite examples, and this is from the Erickson literature, was a time when, and this is so much fun because it is so out in left field in terms of how you do an intervention. But one time this father drags his daughter in to see Dr. Erickson. And he brings her in and he sits her in the chair and he says, sit there. And he pushes her in the chair. And so the daughter sits down and the father looks at Dr. Erickson and he says, she's so headstrong. She's just too headstrong. Her mother, she never listens to her mother and she never listens to me. And Dr. Erickson sat there and looked at the daughter, saying nothing, and looked at the father, and looked at the daughter, and looked at the father, and then looked at the father and said, well, isn't it wonderful that when she grows up and she's on her own, that she'll be able to stand on her own 2 feet? And the dad starts, smoke starts coming out of his ears, and he goes, "Rrr," in his mind, and end of therapy. What I like about that is it's like totally thinking outside of the box. It's because the father brings the child, the father brings the kid here, and here's the kid, and we're going to fix her. And actually no fixing is necessary because she wasn't broken in the first place. So what did he do? He took a look at the context of her being headstrong. Problem, yes. Problem in the family, yes. Problem in the family right now, absolutely. And then he says, now, in his own mind, what's another context? What's another context where the meaning of this behavior will be different? How about when she grows up and she's on her own? That's not a bad idea. Then she won't listen to people who are trying to steer her wrong. So he gives the answer, and the dad just absolutely loves it. Now, to me, that's masterful therapy. And that's an example of a really good context reframe. Now, here's another example. Let's just say that I were to say to you, where you are listening to this program today, and I were to say to you, well, what kind of day is today? And you would say, well, it's either a good day or a bad day. Let me tell you where this story comes from. One day I'm sitting in Anchorage, Alaska, and it's spring in Anchorage, which means it's about 30 degrees. and I mean, it was 30 degrees. But to the boys in Anchorage, it was a shirt sleeve day. And I said it, and the sun was shiny. It was a little overcast, but it wasn't dark, and it wasn't blizzarding, and it wasn't freezing out. It was like this little bit of melt on the snow. And I said to the guys, well, what kind of day is this? And they said, it's fabulous. It's just a wonderful day. It's magnificent. It's great. And I said, now, what would happen if you were sitting on the beach on Maui and you had this kind of day? And they said, oh, that's a bad day. So notice if we didn't change the content of the day one bit. We kept the content of the day the same. What kind of day is it? Good day, bad day, depends on where you are and how much you're paying for the hotel room, really. If you were paying $150 or even greater for a hotel room on Maui and it was a 30-degree day in Anchorage, even though it was a great day for Anchorage, it wouldn't be a great day for Maui. No difference in the content of the day. The only thing that's different is the location. So the basis of context reframing is and you can do it however you do it. But in a context reframe, there are some things that we can shift to shift the context. And let me talk about those. And you may want to make a note of this just because this will help you in terms of how do you think? What is your thinking when you begin to think about what we can shift? Like, how could we shift the context? Well, we could shift the location, as we just did. That's one example. We could shift time and space, or we could shift time. We could shift time forward and time backward. That's what Dr. Erickson did. He shifted time. He thought, okay, what's a different time frame, which is another context. We could also shift circumstances. We could shift circumstances of the family. We could say this behavior in a family, this behavior not in a family. We could also shift business context. How about this behavior in a business context versus in a family context versus in a personal relationship context? We could also change circumstances with regards to age. We could actually change circumstances with regards to age. We could say, well, what happens if you do this in this age? What happens if you do this in this age? We could shift resources. We could actually shift context in terms of resources. What kind of skills would you have now that you didn't have when you were younger? We could shift chunk size. We could chunk up and chunk down by simply asking ourselves for what purpose or what are examples of this. We could chunk up or down. If we chunked up, we could chunk up one level. We could chunk up 2 levels, 3 levels, 4 levels. We could chunk 5 levels. We could chunk down. We could chunk down by going down 3 or 4 or 5 levels. So that gives us some different ideas about shifting context. We could also shift to the intention of the behavior from a content or from a context point of view. We could shift to the intention of the behavior or the consequences of the behavior. Those are all different things that we could begin to shift as we think about shifting and making a change actually in the context. But the easiest thing to do when you come up against a certain context and a certain behavior is you simply ask yourself, what's another context for this behavior where the meaning will be different and will change the meaning for the client, where the client will actually have put a different spin on it, put a different idea or relationship to it. By the way, speaking of the word spin, we've heard a lot in recent years about spin doctors, putting a certain spin on a political message. And that really is just another word for reframing. All the folks who are doing spinning in terms of spinning the media or taking political events and shaping them in a certain way with the media, all of those are simply a process of reframing, or in advance selecting the frame in which you would like this to appear. Okay, so that's a context reframe. Most useful in the case of a comparative deletion where the client says, I'm to X or he's to X. Okay, next is a meaning reframe. A meaning reframe. And a meaning reframe sounds like this. Whenever X happens, I respond Y. Or whenever this happens, I do this. And so in this case, I think what you want to do is you want to ask yourself, what else could this behavior mean? What else could this behavior mean? You could think of an opposite frame. or you could think of a different meaning. You could ask yourself, you could say to yourself, what in the world is it that this person hasn't noticed in this context? Like you could call this person's attention in the same context. You could call this person's attention to something that would bring about a different meaning. And in that sense, that'll change the client's response. So a meaning reframe is best used in the case of a cause and effect, which she makes me feel bad, or a complex equivalence, as in she looked at me that way and that means X. In this case, what you're going to do is change the content. If you want to look at page 12, by the way, of the wall charts of the slides, slide number 72, it talks about the meaning reframe and gives you the specific language category that they're most useful in. And this is the case of a cause and effect and a complex equivalence. So all you want to do is ask yourself, what is an opposite frame? Or what's another frame that will change its meaning? If you change the content, or by having the client notice something they hadn't noticed, or you change the meaning of the behavior, you can also change the meaning itself, the meaning that it has to the client. And that's what we're essentially looking to do in a meaning reframe. Now, here's an example of a meaning reframe specifically. I had a client come to me, and he said, my mother, this was the presenting problem, but the presenting problem was essentially, he came to me and he said, I have low self-esteem. This is one of our business clients. And he said, well, I'm doing okay in business, but I really, really, really have low self-esteem. And so we talked for about a half an hour. And after about a half an hour, he said, I said, so, like, why do you think you have low self-esteem? And he said, my mother didn't love me because she always laid out my clothes when I was a kid and didn't give me any choice about what I was to wear. And so I sat there and congruently said to him, oh my God. And he goes, what? And I said, well, my mother never laid out my clothes. And I thought she wasn't paying attention to me, so I thought she didn't care. And of course, in the same way that the father of the daughter in the previous example, smoke came out his ears, his head started spinning around, and we were done, essentially, although we did do some interventions after that. Clearly, the meaning of the presenting problem to the client was significantly loosened up. It was significantly loosened up. So by changing the meaning, by asking him to notice, in this case, I asked the client to notice an opposite frame. And he got that, well, of course, the exact opposite could be true. And of course, someone loving you has little relationship to whether or not they actually lay out your clothes for you. So meaning reframe, different behavior, opposite frame, and the opposite blows the frame out of the water. So in other words, he got to see how I could feel the same way as he did with a totally exact opposite problem. So that's a meaning reframe. Now, the first thing I think you ought to do in being able to use these, and I think the how of doing this is very, very simple. Here's how you do it. You simply ask yourself a question, and do me a favor, please write this at the bottom of page 67. If you're driving in your car, of course, write it down on your hand or somewhere where you can remember to do it later. And at the bottom of page 67, I'd like you to write the following question. This is a useful question, and we're gonna share this question again with you when you come and take the practitioner training. This is a question where if you don't understand the problem, or if the client has stated something to you in a way which makes it not a problem, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to ask the client that in such a way, this following question, in such a way that it specifies the problem more specifically. And here's the question. The question you want to ask is, how is that a problem? How is that a problem? Now, a lot of times people will give you problems which they assume you have got it figured out how you know it's a problem. And I think as we're moving into reframing, and I think from now on in your career of NLP, I'd like you to begin to think of the following. If you don't understand how the problem is a problem for the client, your intervention is not going to be as good as if you're really clear on what makes that a problem for them. So I think you as the practitioner of NLP, whether you're doing business consulting or educational consulting or just doing straight therapy using NLP, I think that if your problem that the client gives you, if you don't clearly understand how that's a problem, for example, when you try it on, if you put it on in your head and you try this on, you go, okay, this is a problem. How is it a problem? And you don't get how it's a problem. I think you've got to ask that. Now, you can ask the client how it's a problem or how is this a problem until you get to a point where you've got a comparative deletion, which is I'm 2X or he's 2X, or a cause and effect, which whenever she does this, that makes me feel this way, or a complex equivalence, which is whenever X happens, I respond Y. And then you've got it in a form where you can then develop a context reframe or a meaning reframe. Now let's go through a couple of examples. Let me give you a couple of examples. So here's a hotel example now, and many of us involved in teaching spend a fair amount of time on the road. And Wayne Morrison, who works with us, has a really good example on reframing, which I really liked. And Wayne checked into this old hotel, and he walks into the hotel, and he looks at the hotel, and the hotel is like really, really run down. It's just really, really run down. And he sits there and looks at the hotel, and the hotel is really pretty bad. And he walks up to the woman at the front desk, and he says to her, "This hotel is just really, 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 really run down." And she says, "No, it's not run down. It's historic." And he went, "Oh, yeah." Now, there's another meaning reframe. That's a good meaning reframe. It's a really good example. The hotel doesn't change one bit. But if we think that maybe Abraham Lincoln slept here, or some great, political personage from the past, including our current president, for example, what's his name? Even if we think that this is a historic site where a lot of people have slept here, and it's been just a really magnificent place over the many, many years, then that changes the meaning of it from run down. It's a good meaning reframe. And of course, it's very useful for the hotel, I'm sure. Okay, so in order to use this then, what you want to do is simply pay attention to what you're hearing, and when you hear something in the genre of a comparative deletion, which is I'm 2X or he's 2X, or in the area of she makes me feel this way, or whenever X happens, I respond Y, as in a complex equivalence, then you can develop the reframe and begin to think about, do I need a different context, or do I need the same context, and have the person notice things they didn't notice? We'll do a number of examples of reframing in the practitioner training, and I think this is a good preparation. As you begin to think about it, you can begin to go through your day-to-day activity if you'd like to, and take a few days to notice all the possibilities where there could be a reframe. Turn on a news channel, listen to one of the news channels, and watch and notice all the possible reframes that could be existent. Look in your local newspaper. Read the newspaper. Notice all the places where we could do a context reframe or a meaning reframe. And when you come to class, then you'll be thinking in ahead of time in this way, and it'll make it very easy for you. Okay, let's move on and talk about the 6-step reframe. Let's look at page 68. Now, we no longer use the 6-step reframe. It's been replaced by parts integration. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, however, for a couple of reasons. One is for historical purposes, and the other thing is that the process itself has been very useful to me in structuring how I think about certain things. So I'd like to share it with you in the sense that I think it can also change your thinking process, both from the point of view of working with a client, a single client, as well as doing a negotiation with groups of people or with a couple of people. So a 6-step reframe essentially asks us to communicate with a part of the unconscious mind. Let's talk for a moment about parts and just briefly. A part is a part of the unconscious mind. It's a part of the unconscious mind that usually is separated from the rest of the unconscious mind and has some behavior which is being produced that the client is not happy with. You've heard it said, "Oh, part of me made me do that." That's sort of, in essence, where that notion of parts comes from. The notion of parts originally comes from, or at least most popularly comes from, Fritz Perls and Virginia Satir. both of those people, both of those therapists actually used parts integration quite a bit in the therapies that they did. Okay, let's talk about six-step reframe then. The first thing that you want to do, and as I said, we don't do a parts integration too much anymore because the parts integration itself, we found that it was possible to install parts. So we much prefer to use the parts integration rather than a six-step reframe. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is you want to access the behavior that is being created, or access the part of the behavior. So you say, I'd like to ask the part of you responsible for the behavior if it's willing to communicate with me now with a visible body movement, and you actually wait for a signal. Then you say, let's refer to you as part X, although you could give it a name. And you say, I want to thank you for signaling me now. So the idea here is that that particular part does want to communicate with you. And I think usually parts do want to communicate with you. Then you want to discover and acknowledge the benefits. And so you say, part X, I want to acknowledge you for always having acted in, and the client's name, best interest for having provided the benefits for her or for him in the past. We're here to assist you now in simply creating additional choices for his or her life now. Then we create some choices by we say, can you take the part X to the creative part of you and have the part X and the creative part come up with at least 3 additional choices of behavior that will provide you with equal or greater benefit. When you have these 3 additional choices, signal me with a visible body movement. Then you do a congruency check. Now go inside and check for any other parts which might object to adopting these additional choices. If so, will those parts signal me with a visible body movement now? Thank you. And if you get a signal, then you repeat step number 4, creating additional choices agreeable with the creative part, part X, and any other objecting parts. So you actually include other parts that may object to the new behaviors. And then you future pace and test. So you say, now can you step into the near future and put yourself in a situation where you'd have reason to use these additional choices, experiencing this fully now. As I count to 3, you'll open your eyes knowing you've integrated all these choices. 1, 2, 3. Page 69 is another example of a six-step reframe, and I'd like to go over that also because, again, historically, this has played a part in some of the things we're going to cover next, and the kind of thinking is useful. Okay, so you may want to instruct the client, first of all, on the types of signals that could come through and the kind of communication we're setting up. And it says here, reframing can be used with any behavior, internal or external, or any symptom. So number 1, we want to identify the behavior that the client wants more choices about. And again, I think in this case, you want to be sure that you know specifically in your own mind, you want to have the structure of the behavior or the structure of the presenting problem clear enough in your own mind that you can understand the structure of it. Number 2, the client asks the part in charge of the behavior if it's willing to communicate, and you want to get a yes/no signal here. And you ask, or you find out what image or sound or word or sensation was the client aware of when asking the question. You want to ask the part to increase that image, sound, sensation if the answer is yes, and decrease it if the answer is no. And if yes, you thank the part and go on. If no, you thank the part for communicating and reassure the part that it's entirely understandable that it doesn't want to communicate on a conscious level. You reassure the part that it is in charge of behavior X, and you are in no way trying to get rid of it, nor would you want the client or allow the client to attempt to do so either. We're only trying to get some information and some alignment. Step number 3, you ask the part what purpose or function that it has. What's its positive intention? Now, the part can answer consciously or unconsciously. The client will need to accept here that the part does have some positive intention. And of course, in our little branch of NLP, we believe that the unconscious mind and also any part of the unconscious mind does have a positive intention for the client. Now, next, to help the person elicit this, you might ask them to imagine what it might be. And the purpose here, remember that the purpose of finding out the purpose is to separate the behavior from the intention, which again is clearly a process of reframing, and to get the client's conscious mind to begin to appreciate that part as a friend and or as a teacher. You want to thank the part for positive intention to make sure the client begins to sincerely appreciate the part. Then, step number 4, you ask the client to go to the creative part, which is unconscious, and ask that it generate at least 3 alternatives of a behavior that we worked on that would satisfy the intention and accomplish the purpose of behavior X. You can also have the part responsible for the behavior go to the creative part directly to inform that part what its purpose is. That's useful, especially if the purpose remains unconscious. These new choices can be on a conscious level, and you can ask the creative part to give the client a signal when it's generated these new alternatives, and then you thank the creative part. Page 70. Step number 5 is to ask the part responsible for behavior X whether it's willing to use these alternative choices instead of behavior X. And you get a yes-no signal here. If yes, you thank the part and go on. If no, you probably will want to put a time limit on the request, like 2 weeks, to try out some alternatives to see if they're working, if they're effective, if they're available. If you still get a no, then you're going to go back to the creative part and ask the creative part to help generate alternatives that the other part would be willing to try out, at least for a limited time. Then step number 6, the ecology, or you want to thank the part. Then step number 6, the ecology check. You want to ask the client to check with all the parts to make sure that they're all comfortable and they accept the entire process and the alternatives. If the answer is yes, then you can thank all the parts and surprise and delight the self in the future. If no, you can check on how the client knows this, and also how this represents an objection. So the client says, no, it's not all okay. You say, how do you know? And when the client tells you how he or she knows, then you ask, how does this represent an objection? Then you ask the image, the sound or sensation, to increase if needed, and reassure the client that any objection is an important part of the process and important information and is welcome. If there's an objection, you want to go back to step number 3 and go through the process with the part that objects, making sure that the objecting part and the part that runs behavior X all agree on the alternatives and can actually work together. So you want to treat the parts of a person as though they were all parts of a negotiating team in this ecology section. It's important that each member's function and purpose be respected and paid attention to. And you can cycle back through the process until you get full acceptance for any alternative behavior from all the parts involved. Remember that the main purpose of the structure of a 6-step reframe is to establish, that is to set up, channels or bridges of communication between the client's unconscious and conscious mind, even between parts of the client's unconscious mind, and to install in that person a belief that all parts are allies and that they can be potential teachers and or friends. Okay, excellent. So that's a 6-step reframe. We've included it for historical purposes, as well as it sort of structures our thinking, I think. I like the way the thought process occurs there, although, again, we no longer use the technique because it was found to install parts. Let's move on to meta model number 3 and page 71. So why don't you go ahead and turn to page 71. Now, meta model 3 is a set of detailed questions for producing a specific result. And although that we don't actually go into the details of how and why this works here during our practitioner training, you need to know it's also part of the master practitioner training, and we go quite in depth in this when we talk about quantum linguistics. But here's a whole nother form of reframing, which is really kind of interesting. By the way, a lot of people talk about the meta model 3 and say that there are 3 meta models. Meta model 1, of course, is the meta model that you know. Meta model 2 was the precision model created by John Grinder and was published in the book The Precision Model, or Precision Communication, I believe. And then the third process of meta model, which is, this isn't actually the meta model 3, this is only an example of what it might be if it did exist, is on page 71. And so the client comes to you with a problem, and you can say to the client, what's wrong? What caused this problem? How have you failed to resolve this? And how can you overcome the solution to your problem? Then we flip it and we say, what would you like to change? When will you stop it from being a limitation? And how many ways do you know you've solved this? And then you confirm, I know that you are changing and seeing things differently. That's kind of fun, huh? So meta model 3 is directed questioning or detailed questioning for a specific result. And it's questioning that moves us in a certain direction. It's directed questioning that actually takes and moves the problem in a very specific direction and moves it in a certain way and then causes the problem to change. Try this out with a client or with yourself, but probably better with a client so that they can read or have someone read these to you if you have a specific problem, a minor problem. And notice what happens. Notice if it changes when you go through this. Okay. Now let's move on to page 72. And this is an example. This is an NLP model of therapy. When I first got into NLP, there was no model or chart of what to do when. Like what do I do when this happens, or what's the order and sequence that I want to be doing this in. And so here's a real clear example, it seems to me, and the order and sequence that we could actually put this into, and makes it very, very simple. Okay, so let's look at page 72. Now, a client generally walks in a present state, and they want to end up in, on the right-hand side, a desired state, or they walk in on the bottom of the chart, left-hand side, with their old model of the world, and they'd like to end up with, on the right-hand side, bottom of the chart, a new model of the world. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the first thing we do is we want to discover their model of the world. And we'll use the meta model. We'll take a detailed personal history if we know how to do that. That's a part of the master timeline therapy training. And that's part of your master practitioner training when you take that. We want to establish rapport, obviously. We want to set outcomes, and you've got a whole lot of stuff on outcome definition, which is useful. You probably would want to get meta programs and values. That's a master practitioner level material. But you will certainly want to look at the client's presuppositions. What presuppositions are inherent in what they're saying to you? You will want to go through the keys to an achievable outcome and talk with the client about the outcomes. You'll probably want to make sure that the client's outcome is well formed, that it has, that it conforms as an outcome to what the client wants, conforms to the well-formedness conditions, and you probably will want to elicit some of the client's strategies. Depending on the presenting problem, you may elicit the decision-making strategy, you may elicit the reassurance strategy and or the motivation strategy. Now, the purpose of this first section is to establish rapport and to spend enough time asking the client questions so that we can determine the model of the world. Now, you see here, step number 2 is loosen the model of the world, and I'm not going to jump there yet, but I want to point out to you that the model of the world typically should be discovered, it seems to me, before you loosen it up. I have, with some clients on certain occasions, loosened up the model of the world before I discovered fully what it was, and I'll tell you that that is not as exact and not as precise as fully discovering what the client's model of the world is now as it is, and then step number 2, beginning to loosen it up. Now, step number 1 and step number 2 could occur at roughly the same time, but they should be sequential. In other words, we could spend some time talking to the client before we actually do the therapy, and that would be step number 1 and step number 2. So as you go through the model of the world, as you're discovering the client's model of the world, the client will say certain things to you. You want to pay attention to the meta model violations that you hear. You want to pay attention to the patterns that you're listening to, the language patterns, especially if you can pick them out. If you can't actually pick them out easily, you may want to simply develop questions to ask. You may want to develop questions to ask that would be that would somehow later on loosen up the client's model of the world. So you may simply want to write down those questions. I think with regards to the detailed personal history, it seems to me that you ought to get enough information from the client so that your intervention can be appropriate for them. I don't ever simply take a canned intervention, whether I'm doing business consulting or educational consulting or therapeutic consulting. I won't ever simply take a canned intervention off the shelf and use it. Every single intervention I do for every single client is tailored. It's tailored specifically for the specific client and for the specific presenting problem that the client gives me. So I think in each case, you need to know at least something about the client's history. Establishing rapport is obviously important in this very early part of the session, and setting outcomes. You want to set some outcomes. You want to find out what their meta programs and values are as you do, get their presuppositions. Go through the keys to an achievable outcome if you want to. You have those in your notes, and you go through those in the well-formedness conditions, you'll probably end up with a pretty good set of what the client's model of the world is and where the desired state is. Now, at the same time as you get the present state, you're going to ask the client about the desired state. As you're asking the client about the desired state, I'd like you to calibrate the client for that desired state. In other words, when the client says to you, So the client says, I got this problem. You say to the client, well, what would you like to have instead? Now, as the client goes through and tells you what they'd like to have instead, you should calibrate what they're giving you for that specifically, so that as they go through and tell you the desired state, you'll know from the physiology, from the lower lip size, from the pupils focus and dilation, from the skin tonus and skin color, from the breathing rate and location, you'll know everything about that from a point of view of physiology. So that when the client gets to the desired state, that's one of the messages that you can figure, okay, I'm done. Okay. Now, step number 2 is we're going to loosen up the model of the world. We'll use the Milton model to loosen it up a little bit. We'll use Meta Model 3. We may use language patterns, including reframing, and we may do logical levels of therapy, which is a master practitioner level part of the training. Using all of that, we want to loosen up the model of the world sufficiently so that it doesn't have a really tight hold on the client. If the model of the world has a tight hold on the client, then the intervention is going to be less successful. So we want to do something in step number 2 that's going to directly go against the model of the world. And we'll talk a little bit about that when you come to the practitioner training. Okay, now step number 3. In step number 3, we're going to do anchoring, reframing, some modalities work, timeline therapy. We may do some values work. That's from the master practitioner training. We may do some hypnosis, which you'll get during our practitioner training. We may work on strategies. We may do an intervention on strategies, or we may do a parts integration, which we'll be talking about shortly. So all of that would be the change work. Whatever needed to be done there in the change work section, that's what we do. Now, assuming we looked at the client and we had the present state, assuming we had the client's desired state in mind and we talked to the client, we'd already calibrated it, then the purpose of the change work and the loosening of the model of the world in the second section is to move the client toward that desired state so we can actually see the shift in the client's physiology as we move the client in that direction. Okay, then we should be almost at the desired state or at the desired state at this point. You've moved the client from the present state to the desired state, or almost to the desired state. Now the thing we want to do is the cleanup. So we're going to check ecology. We talked a little bit about some of the ecological considerations in the 6-step reframe, where we wanted to make sure that it was congruent with all of the unconscious mind. We want to make sure that all of the various parts of the unconscious mind have congruency about this issue and make sure that everything is totally in alignment at the unconscious mind. This may require that you do a parts integration. You may want to do a parts integration at that point. You may feel the need to do further cleanup or further ecology. Now, and I want you to notice too that parts integration appears in 2 different places. Parts integration appears in 2 different places. It appears under change work, and it also appears under cleanup. That's how important it is. It's that important because I think either it's going to appear at number 3 because you're going to get a sense that there are some parts that are conflicted when you go through and establish the client's model of the world, or it won't have come up. It won't have come up, and then this is simply a reminder, if it hasn't come up yet, to deal with it at step number 4, to check the ecology. And remember, ecology is the study of consequences. So we're going to check the nature of the change for self, for others, for family, for business, for society, and also for the planet, and make sure that the ecology is appropriate there. Okay, now I'm assuming we've done step number 4, the cleanup, and then step number 5 is going to be the future pace, which includes testing the new behaviors and making sure the convincer is filled up. So how are we going to do that? Well, first we're going to test, and of course we've had some tests in our scripts that we gave you. There's a test in each one, and you can look at the nature of those tests. The nature of the test under step number 5, where it says test and future pace, is the nature of the test is essentially that we're going to test to see if the client can do it at this point. Yes, you can do it now, or can you do it now? Yes, no, I can't do it anymore, or yes, I can. If of course the client can do it, then we can go back and do some more change work at step number 3. Once we've tested, and we've tested the new behaviors and make sure they're in place, we then want to do a future pace. And the future pace essentially will go like this. I wonder if you can imagine a time in the future, which if it had happened in the past, you would have produced a certain behavior. Now I want you to go out into the future and when you get out there, notice if you still produce that behavior or if you do not. And how many times do we want to test in future pays? I think we want to test in future pays in each case until the convincer is totally filled up. We talked about the convincer with regards to strategies. But assuming a person has an automatic convincer, well, then they'd be automatically convinced the change had taken place. Assuming they had a one-time convincer or a two-time convincer, we would continue to test. And as you'll see during the timeline therapy training section, that we will actually test until the client convinces us. And I think that's a real important part of it. If you come to the practitioner training, I'll have the opportunity to demonstrate to you the process. And you'll see exactly how we test and test and test and test until the client's convincing us, no, I've changed. And you could say, well, have you really? And no, I've really changed. Yes, this is it. It's done. It's totally gone. And then the client convinces us. And so the client essentially tells us that the client's done. Now that's a real key piece. The client's told us they're done. The client simply is convincing us that they're done. We're not convincing them. We're not saying, oh yes, I think you've changed. The client now has to convince us and tell us, I've changed. I'm so certain I've changed. And here's how I know I've changed because blah, 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 blah. So the key there is the client tells us. And that's why it says fill up the convincer there. And then the client ends up in the desired state and they end up with the new model of the world being their current operative condition. That kind of therapy, if we make sure that we take care of all of those bases, including doing some timeline therapy to clean up the historical issues, make sure we get the parts all integrated, that kind of therapy is a very long-lasting kind of change, even though it's brief therapy, is a very long-lasting kind of change. Whether we're changing someone's, personal history in terms of making more money, whether we're doing a business consulting performance enhancement program, and we want to assist the client in making a lot more money, or whether we're doing therapy, perhaps for better relationships, or perhaps the person gets along better with other people, or whether we're doing educational consulting, where the student gets better grades and feels better about themselves. This particular model of therapy has very, very long-lasting results, assuming that you've used timeline therapy along with it and parts integration. And that makes the NLP really, really, really powerful and makes sure that the changes occur the way we want them to. Okay. So we've taken a look at reframing. We've taken a look at both meaning and context reframing and the 6-step reframe and the NLP model of therapy. And now it's time to simply move on and talk about parts integration, which we're going to do in our next segment. This is program number 12, and we thank you for listening. Come back and join us for program number 13, which follows next.